Hello, Health Science 3052. This is Professor Van Dyke, and I've got 2 weeks worth of videos for you. So this will be the first video, and then I'll send over the second video afterwards. So this is the video for Tuesday, September 1st, and it's going to cover slides 29 through 56 on the intro PowerPoint. So we're going to run through these slides, and again, I'm not going to pour over these word for word. I'm going to try and hit the highlights on them, but certainly I will expect that you will have read the PowerPoints as opposed to having to read the whole book. I think this is a pretty good deal. So make sure and read the PowerPoints, okay? So we're starting out on slide 29 for the title of the slide is Environment, and then we're going to work through these. I'm going to try and keep you posted on which number slide I'm on as I'm moving through these. So again, these are the important terms that I need you to know. So this specific lecture is going to focus on a lot of the lexicon that I'm going to expect you to be able to know as we're moving through future lectures. So starting with the environment. The environment is composed essentially of the atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere, and biosphere. And in regard to each of these, so the atmosphere is going to be comprised of the envelope of gases that surrounds the planet. And certainly, as you know, while it is fairly oxygen rich, it's primarily composed mostly of nitrogen, oxygen, a small percentage of carbon dioxide, and some intermediate gases as well. So this is that envelope that surrounds the Earth. Onto the hydrosphere, which is all the water on the planet. So this includes lakes, streams, rivers, certainly underground aquifers, things like that. And then the lithosphere is going to be all the solid components, which is comprised of the crust and the mantle. And then the biosphere is going to be all living entities on the planet. So this is animals, plants, microbes, things of that nature. On to the next slide, slide 30. This is a visual representation of what we just discussed, atmosphere, biosphere, lithosphere. So as you can see, the atmosphere is essentially that gas that surrounds the planet. Let's just move on. So with definitions, we have ecology. Ecology can be the science of the relationships between living organisms and their environment. So these are the ecological pieces. How do certain entities survive within their environment, the living organisms and the environment themselves. So this is how do they live on the lithosphere? How do they extract water from the hydrosphere? Things of that nature. This could be autoecology and synecology, which will be the next two slides. So autoecology is slide 32. This is the ecology of a species or individual organism in relation to the environment. So this is like population ecology when you're looking at a specific species and its direct interaction with the environment itself. And then you also have synecology, which is the study of environmental relationships among communities of individuals. So this is going to be more like community ecology, where you're dealing with multiple species interacting within the community. So you could say the synecology of Cal State San Bernardino includes roadrunners and rattlesnakes and humans and certainly tarantulas, birds, things like that. So that would be that synecology component. That's slide 33. On to slide 34. And again, this is going to be definition heavy, a lot of terms that I'm throwing at you. I do expect you to be able to know these, so make sure and ask any questions that you have over email. So when we're on slide 34, when we're discussing species, this is a primary biological unit of interbreeding individuals that are reproductively isolated from other groups. So we can't breed with other species cannot breed with us, so we would be an independent species therein. On to slide 35, population. Population is considered a group or team of potentially interbreeding individuals of a species in a given area. So you could say the population of humankind at Cal State San Bernardino or in Southern California, or a population of humans in all of China, and these would be the populations that we'd be able to add a numerical value to. On to slide 36. Community refers to a coexisting interdependent population in a given ecosystem. So we could talk about, like, say, the communities in a rainforest or the desert community, and say that yes, there are humans that live there, but there are also roadrunners, there are rattlesnakes, there are Joshua trees. These are all part of that community. And then slide 37 is going to be ecotone. So an ecotone is ecological community where you have overlap, where vegetation is going to be mixed vegetation will be formed by overlapping of adjoining communities. So like say for instance, if you go to where Joshua trees are, this has a marked line of demarcation on high and low elevations, but they're going to overlap slightly with other things like possibly chaparral, maybe things of that nature, where you're going to have a very light overlapping. So these ecotones can exist. Ecotones, one of the places that you'll hear me discuss frequently is the Darwin's finches, because I know you're all familiar with them, and they certainly each finch species can occupy its own ecotone because of the fact that it made adaptations based on environmental pressure. So ecosystem on slide 38 refers to a given environment in which interdependent living organisms or populations coexist in relation to the abiotic components of the environment. So the abiotic components are going to be the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, and essentially you can draw a line of demarcation between the lithosphere and the hydrosphere, and separate those off from the biosphere itself. So when we talk about an ecosystem, it's how those living entities of the biosphere interact with the lithosphere and the hydrosphere. So obviously the next component, abiotic, is physical rather than biological. So it's not derived from these organisms, but essentially is going to be derived from the abiotic. So that's going to be that piece that kind of delineates for ecosystems. So you can have a desert, you can have a mountain complex, you can have all these different components, and how do the living entities, the biosphere, interact within that abiotic component, and that's going to be the ecosystem. So slide 39, ecological succession refers to ecological change where one species succeeds and the other in space and time, utilizing the same exact resources. So ecological succession, one of the things you can think about with this is how certain trees will overtake other trees, like a sequoia grove will overtake all smaller trees like dogwoods and things like that. But you can also think about, like with modern humans, how we succeeded over Neanderthals and earlier humans, humanoids. So how that occurred. So we were utilizing the same resources in the same space and time, but modern humans certainly did dominate and force the Neanderthals off of the plane of existence. So slide 40, you can actually see ecological succession with this graphic. So you have annual plants leading all the way up to the hardwoods on the right side, and you have time that runs across the bottom of this if you were to look at it as though it was a graph. Annual plants leading to perennials, to shrubs, to softwoods, to a hardwood forest. So they're in the exact same space, but slowly over time, one species will dominate and overtake the others. Pioneer plants, these are first stage plants in succession process, and they start colonization under very adverse conditions generally. Certainly with pioneer plants, you can think about like when we have a wildfire at Cal State San Bernardino, you'll notice that specific grasses and very small plants will begin to grow first in this very adverse environment that certainly lacks shade, it tends to be sun dominant, but these pioneer plants are the first to be able to utilize this niche and this space and time based around whatever event it was that cleared that space out. On to slide 42 with the climax community. When both biotic and abiotic entities of an ecosystem reach a self-perpetuating stage, you're going to reach a climax community. So you're going to have the biotic and the abiotic coming together. And you really see this with places like the sequoias or the redwood forests, where the landscape, the lithosphere, the hydrosphere of the abiotic components perfectly complement that biotic life that is manifesting in that specific area, and this would be a climax community. So slide 43 is a graphic of a climax community. You can see an image there, and you can see the hardwood trees in the back, and you can see more of a like a prairie in the front, These would be climax communities in these specific areas. So if this was like a river, like the Cedar River going through Iowa, what you would notice is that the areas of grassland are going to dominate those central areas that don't have the same abiotic components. So the abiotic in this specific graphic, if this was the Cedar River in Iowa, you would have like the river flowing by those trees in the background that allows like the red cedars to dominate along the riverside, and then you would have these rolling grasslands that would dominate the remainder of the environment, that environmental space, and they would be the climax communities for those specific areas. So with ecological dominance, this is basically a species that exerts major modifying influences on the community. So you remember the community is multiple species living in a specific area. And certainly with ecological dominance, you can think of humankind. We're really good at dominating the landscape, and we've really affected a change in the communities around us. You can think of like the peppered moth in England, where you had this moth that actually went from being white to being black because of our influence in that specific environment, how we burn so much coal that it caused them to change through environmental pressure, but through ecological dominance and how we affected that specific species. That's slide 44. So on to slide 45, I'm going to throw some terms at you fairly quickly. Hopefully these are all review for you, that you've seen these before. A niche is going to be a place or position of an organism in the environment, and it refers to the species resource utilization within that community. And essentially, we're going to go back to the Darwin's finches here. I want you to think about this from a standpoint of the fact that with Darwin's finches, each one of them kind of developed adaptations based on the niche that they were immediately exploiting. It could have been something in regard to how their wings were formed because they were getting into smaller spaces. It also had a major effect on the beak itself based on what they were actually eating. So their niche in the environment caused environmental pressure to sculpt the beak on these Darwin's finches, which is where you see a lot of these changes in regard to the niches that they specifically lived in. A habitat applies to the abiotic and biotic environment in which a species exists. We kind of talked a little bit about that. So again, this is going to be abiotic from the standpoint of the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and it's also going to factor in those biotic pieces in regard to the living entities from the biosphere. So a habitat could be looking at how a specific, maybe a peregrine falcon derives food sources along the cliffs of San Onofre, right there by the ocean. So you've got the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, and the biosphere working simultaneously to develop a habitat for a specific living entity. I hope this is all coming together. It kind of, a lot of terms all at once, but you can kind of see how they all fit together. And then a biotope is going to be the environment in which a community exists. So, like say for instance, the biotope for San Bernardino, that environment is very specific. It's, an arid desert, and we have a community that lives at, in and around Cal State San Bernardino in that specific environment. And then a biome is going to be a community of living organisms of a single major ecological region. So this is going to be a larger region, and certainly with biomes, we're going to run through some major biomes here on 46, 47. So we're on slide 46 right now. So biomes are communities of regional climatic zones that have unique temperatures, rainfall, photoperiods, things of that nature. So obviously, Alaska in the wintertime is going to have a very different photoperiod than living in Ecuador, and certainly the rainfall is going to be different, the temperatures are going to be different, and they sculpt the planet in regard to the species that can live there. So the major biomes of the earth, the tundra, taiga, temperate deciduous forest, grasslands, deserts, tropical rainforests, and the mountain complexes. Mountain complexes are interesting because, say for instance, if you go up to Palm Springs Tram, you'll pass through 4 major biomes as you go from the desert floor to the evergreens at the top. So very fascinating stuff in regard to how biomes can vary based on mountain complexes. But certainly we want to focus on the major biomes that we'll go ahead and talk about. So slide 47, you can look at major biomes in the world. You can see that tropical rainforests exist primarily on the equator. Pretty straightforward. So if you look at Central America, South America, and certainly over into Africa on the equatorial line, you'll see those mountain tropical rainforests. You'll also see the tundra at the very top with that lavender color, kind of lavendery, and then the taiga in dark green. So these are pretty easy to spot, but you can imagine how environmental pressure will sculpt these areas very readily. So slide 48, the major biomes, certainly there are going to be a handful of test questions on this stuff, so make sure and read them over, but my tests are pretty easy. As long as you follow along, as long as you read the PowerPoints and you watch the videos, you're going to do really well on the exams, so keep that in mind. The tundra is going to be easy to spot because of that layer of permafrost. They're going to have very low rainfall. Vegetation is going to be small mosses, lichens, low grass, and very small perennials. Very few limited dominant fauna in these areas. So the tundra is generally a very harsh place to live that you really are going to see some very scrubby and remote growth in regard to the biosphere. So this is the tundra. And with the taiga, we have northern coniferous swamp forest with moderate rainfall, very poor drainage. That's going to lead to a lot of lakes and bogs and ponds. These areas they're going to be easy to recognize because they're going to have these swampy areas with massive amounts of insects and a lot of magnificent coniferous swamp forest. So that's the taiga. And then the temperate deciduous forest is going to be south of the taiga. Sorry, I got to move this over a bit. Milder climate generally, abundant rainfall, and relative evaporation as well. Evapotranspiration is just the evaporation from plants and land itself. So that's the temperate deciduous forest. And then onto grassland on slide 49. With grassland, you're going to have insufficient rainfall. So this is like Iowa, certainly in Nebraska, certain areas. You're going to have these grassland effects where you're not going to have high rain. So they're going to keep tree growth at a minimum. Very good for agriculture. Okay, so these are generally going to be the places that you're going to think of when you think of vast fields of corn and wheat and soybeans. It's going to be these grassland areas. And then onto the desert, which is situated between 30 north and 30 south latitude. It's going to have less than 10 inches of rainfall, high daytime temperatures, more annual types of vegetation. So this would be, obviously the Sahara Desert. You're going to have the Gobi Desert, a number of these locations that are kind of right in between that 30 north, 30 south latitude. And then the tropical rainforest, so South and Central America, Central Africa, very high rainfall, sometimes exceeding 100 inches of rain. And this is going to be the highest in regard to biodiversity. Tropical rainforests are going to really dominate in regard to the biosphere. It's going to have the highest density of flora and fauna of any other given area. So with the biomes, just remember they're good for agriculture, good for growing crops. Deserts are less than 10 inches of rainfall, high daytime temperatures. Tropical rainforests are going to have the highest biodiversity in regard to flora and fauna. On to slide 50. Competitive displacement, and we're moving right through this, so I'd like to keep these fairly short for you. I really want you to see these videos as something that can help you out and not be a hindrance to you. So slide 50 is competitive displacement. This is a theory that no two species with identical needs can coexist and only one is going to survive. So they're going to be limiting factors that generate environmental pressure, like food supply, water, light. So you really see light with the plants that are going to grow. You're not going to have grassland that's growing underneath a hardwood forest. It's going to be extremely rare. So these limiting factors in regard to life providing entities and organisms and components that will generate life are going to be limiting factors. And competitive displacement essentially says that one is going to win out, and it's traditionally what we see. Now, with regard to Neanderthals and humans, that's kind of an interesting process with competitive displacement, because that was always the given thought was that modern humans just dominated and they forced the Neanderthals off of the existence plane on the planet Earth. But essentially, what we really start to think about and we really start to see with all this genetic material that's being gathered up from, like, I don't remember any of the names of the sites, but you can submit your DNA and they tell you where you're from. What we've actually been able to see with this is that you can find some Neanderthal DNA traces that appear to have indicated that there was actually interbreeding going on. So again, this kind of leads to the question of what's going on in regard to species. I mean, was there a possibility that we could interbreed? And look it up, do some research on it. It's really cool stuff. So certainly environmental pressure can begin to have an effect on things like species progeny. Another good example of why competitive displacement isn't a total theory on everything is you can look at the coy wolf, which is a coyote wolf hybrid, and if you go far enough, you can actually see some unusual things that are occurring between the polar bears and grizzly bears far up north. So some interesting stuff going on. A lot of environmental pressure that's currently being exerted upon the species of the planet, and because of that we're seeing some interesting things. So competitive displacement essentially is that theory that you can't have two species existing and utilizing the same resources. One's going to win out. On to slide 51. This is going to be a fairly important slide as well. So food chain, we're going to talk about the food chain, what are the components of the food chain, and then we're going to talk about a couple of food chain types. With regard to the food chain, you have producers, consumers, and decomposers. These are all pretty straightforward. So producers are going to be the green plants that are going to be the energy producers. So you can imagine plants are going to channel the sun's energy into growth, and then those producers are going to be eaten by the consumers. So consumers are going to be the animals. They're going to be herbivores and carnivores. So the herbivores are going to draw their nutrients directly from the producers, and then the carnivores are going to come along and eat the herbivores. But to take, for example, bears, which are omnivores, they're going to eat plants, they're going to eat insects, they're going to eat other carnivores. So these are all going to be considered as consumers. And then the third component of the food chain is the decomposers, and these are going to be the microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, things like that. And they are very important. If it weren't for the decomposers, we would just be surrounded by a mess of a nightmare of things that had fallen and died and never got a chance to decompose. So producers, consumers, and decomposers, very important. So pretty straightforward. Producers are going to be the plants and things like that, and then consumers will come along and eat the plants, and they will also consume themselves through the carnivore herbivore interaction, and then the decomposers are going to be left to break down everything that remains when these things die. On to slide 52. These are types of food chains. So we have three types that we're going to focus on here. We have the grazing type, the detritus type, and the parasitic type. And I'm pretty sure there's a test question on this. There's a whole bunch of test questions on the materials that you're getting today. So just make sure you know what it is. And again, as I had mentioned before, with your exam, I usually give you a lot more than 2 hours to take the exam. I just usually leave it up. I know it's hard to get to it and be able to process it within that 2-hour window. So I try to make this class as easy as possible for you. So with the grazing type, you have the grass, which is eaten by the rabbit, and the rabbit is then eaten by the fox. So that is the grazing type. You essentially have the rabbit grazing on the grass, and then the fox comes along and eats the rabbit. So that's the grazing type, grass to rabbit to fox. Then you have the detritus type. This is where dead organic matter is decomposed by microorganisms. So you have organic matter, like even grass clippings or something like this, and then it's consumed by the fly maggot, and then the fly maggot is consumed by the beetle. So this is the detritus type. So you have the organic matter is eaten by the fly maggot, which is eaten by the beetle. And then you have the parasitic type, where energy passes from a larger animal to a smaller. So what you have is the dog is fed upon by the dog flea, and then the dog flea is fed upon by protozoan parasites. So this is kind of the reverse of what you expect in regard to a food chain. So this is kind of what we look at as the food chain in a reverse process, where it goes from a larger entity to a smaller entity. So these are the three types of food chains. Make sure you know those. And then on to slide 53, biogeochemical processing cycle. This is essentially the cycling of the Earth's material through the living system and back to the Earth. So you can really think about, like with us, we're going to be here, we're going to be full of nutrients, macronutrients, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur. And when we die, that biogeochemical process is going to put that nutrient back into the ground. And those are going to be the major macronutrients. And then you also have micronutrients like iron, copper, zinc, manganese, chlorine, iodine, things like that. So these are going to be the micronutrients, but certainly macronutrient standpoint, the macronutrients are really what we focus on. There are going to be two types of cycles for biogeochemical processing, and that's going to be gaseous and sedimentary. We'll jump on to slide 54, which shows the gaseous cycle. Elements move in gas, form through the atmosphere in water. Recycling in this process is a lot quicker than the other, which we'll talk about here in a second. So the gaseous cycle moves very quickly. Nitrogen fixing is the last component of this gaseous cycle. Slide 54. Very fascinating stuff, how bacteria called rhizobium will actually work in plants to do some pretty amazing things in regard to nutrients and kind of carrying those and allowing plants to utilize them. So that's slide 54. And then on to slide 55, which is the sedimentary cycle. So the gaseous cycle works much faster. The sedimentary cycle on 55 is a slower process compared to the gaseous cycle, which makes sense. Elements involved are iron, calcium, phosphorus. So with the phosphorus cycle, this is that process where DNA and RNA, there you have energy transfer with ADP and ATP. So hopefully you took biology and things like that beforehand. So this is that sedimentary process where things are going to happen much slower, but obviously the Earth is a continuing recycling process, and we certainly look at that with the sedimentary cycle and the gaseous cycle. So on to slide 56, which is going to be our last slide, because we'd already covered the other materials in regard to environmental laws and the agencies that control these laws. So on slide 56, we're going to talk about human community disturbances, and we've definitely had our hand in this. So there's a lot of things going on here. We'll focus on the killer bees, which were released in Brazil in about 1957 and spread into the U.S. In the 1990s. And certainly with regard to the killer bees, it's been an interesting process to watch this occur, but as colony collapse has kind of settled in around us, we've seen some fairly interesting things occur. And certainly if you like getting fruits and specific vegetables all year long, we might be looking at the killer bee as the reason that we're able to see these things, because there wasn't a lot of booming agriculture in areas of South America like Brazil, certainly Argentina, Chile, places like this. And once these bees were introduced, they allowed for extraordinary amounts of pollination. Bees are a critical component. So like with our almond orchards in Central California. Most almonds of the world are grown in this area, and if it weren't for the bees, we would not have almonds. So it's a really fascinating process when we talk about a community disturbance by introducing these species that just tend not to exist there. You can also see this with things like Arundo donax. This is a plant that grows along all of our waterways in Southern California. It's called creek cancer, and it just dominates and makes a huge change in those waterways, and certainly has an impact on the community itself. So as you remember, with community, we have multiple species living in the exact same area. And then we also have agromonoculture, which has our fingerprints all over it. Does it affect community in regard to the colony collapse disorder with the bees? Probably, but certainly it's multifactorial. But we grow the same thing all over a specific area, and it can potentially have an effect on the community in that area. And there's lots of other examples. So that's slide 56. That's the last slide for this lecture. Now, again, read over your special assignment and what you need to do. You need to have a peer-reviewed journal article that you're going to write, basically a literature review on that article, and you're going to tell us what you learn. The class should obviously, unfortunately, we can't do class presentations, which is a big part for me. I really do love class presentations, and I miss them dearly. But fortunately, I get to read all your papers, and I get to see your presentation, because you're going to provide me some form of a video, or you're going to provide me with a PowerPoint where you do speaking over the PowerPoint. So it's going to be a lot of fun. I encourage you to give it a lot of thought, be creative with it, do something that you may never have done before, try a different software. Powtoons, you really can't do Powtoons because it has a limit of about 3 minutes on the free version. So I would encourage you to even do what I'm doing right now. You can use your cell phone, record a video, send it over to me, post it on YouTube, send me the link, whatever's easiest for you. I don't want this to be exceedingly cumbersome. I know you have a lot of classes, and certainly most of you are not environmental health students, so this can be a challenge, and I want this class to go well for you. So this is the first video. This is for Tuesday, September 1st. I'm going to post this video, and then I will also do the second video as well, which will give you the videos for Tuesday and Thursday for coursework. So make sure you're staying up with those, and keep reading the announcements on Blackboard so you know what's going on. Okay, so I'll get started on the second video, and have a wonderful night.